He said it over pot roast. Blake set down his fork, cleared his throat, and announced it the way people announce the weather. Calm, already decided, not really asking for a response. "Norma, you're holding us back." Then he slid a printed sheet of paper across the dinner table like he was presenting a business proposal and told me I had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Amber, my daughter, stared at the center of the table the whole time. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just kept her hands folded in her lap and let her husband do the talking, the way she had been doing for years now, whenever something uncomfortable needed to be said out loud. My grandson, who is 7 years old and honest in the way only young children are, looked at me with wide eyes and asked the question nobody else in that room was willing to ask. "Grandma, did you do something wrong?" I looked at his face. I looked at Amber's hands folded in her lap. I looked at Blake's expression, which was the expression of a man who had already made peace with a decision long before announcing it. And I understood something clearly in that moment. This was not a fight that started tonight. This was not a disagreement that got out of hand. This was a conclusion they had reached privately, probably over several conversations I was never included in. And this dinner, with its pot roast and its printed paper and its 30-day countdown, was simply the announcement. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the sheet of paper, folded it once along the center, and placed it beside my plate. Then I finished my dinner. Because whatever came next was going to require a clear head, and I had spent 62 years learning that the worst thing you can do when someone takes a shot at you is fall apart in front of them. My name is Norma Whitmore. I am 62 years old, widowed, and I have spent my entire adult life being the person people lean on without ever really seeing. After my husband passed, I sold the house where Amber grew up, the house where I had painted every wall myself and replaced the kitchen floor twice, and I put the largest portion of that money into Blake and Amber's home. The plan, at the time, sounded reasonable. We would live together, share expenses, help each other. Amber would have support with the children. I would have family around me during the hardest years of my life. It would work because we would make it work. I cooked nearly every meal. I handled school pickups 5 days a week. I covered groceries when the month ran long, which it did often. I took over the books for Blake's remodeling business because he was behind on invoices, behind on taxes, and had 2 suppliers threatening to stop filling his orders. I sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, and I fixed what he couldn't manage during the day. I did all of that, and I never once asked anyone to thank me. The night Blake called me dead weight and told me I had 30 days to leave, I waited until the house went quiet. Then I went to my room, unlocked the fireproof box I had kept under my bed since my husband died, and I began going through every piece of paper inside it. Receipts, records, signed agreements, notes I had written to myself so I would never forget exactly what had happened, in exactly what order, from the very first day I moved in. My husband had raised me to document things carefully. Sitting on the edge of my bed with those papers spread around me, I was, for the first time in years, deeply grateful that I had listened to him. The cruelty ran deeper than one dinner. I found that out the next morning when I tried to log into the business accounting software. My password no longer worked. Blake had changed the credentials overnight, before I had even had time to drink my first cup of coffee. I called the main supplier I had been managing for 2 years. The man who answered told me, in a careful and slightly embarrassed voice, that Blake had already been in touch and had informed him that I had stepped away from the company. Not left. Not been asked to leave. Stepped away, as if it had been my own quiet, personal decision. I set the phone down and looked at the printed sheet of house rules Blake had given me the night before. I read it slowly, from the beginning. Most of it was what you might expect. Don't speak about household finances with outsiders. Don't have guests without prior notice. Don't enter certain rooms without permission. The kind of language that sounds like reasonable boundaries on the surface until you read carefully enough to see what it is really doing. But one line stopped me completely. It said I was no longer permitted to speak with banks, suppliers, or clients on their behalf. Their behalf. I had to read that twice. I had spent 4 years fielding calls from overdue suppliers. I had spent 4 years explaining to bank officers why a payment was going to be 3 days late and could they please hold the charge. I had spent 4 years writing the emails Blake couldn't find the right words for and making the calls he was too proud to make himself. And now, in a single printed line, all of that work had been reframed as something I had done on their behalf, as if it were a favor they were now choosing to withdraw. I folded the sheet carefully and put it back in my bag. Then I opened the fireproof box again and started organizing. I went to the bank on a Thursday morning, 4 days after the dinner. I had an appointment with the loan officer, a brisk, well-organized woman whose name I had known for 3 years because I had been the one handling communications on Blake's accounts since the very beginning. I sat across from her and told her I was there to close my personal account and transfer the funds. She nodded, pulled up the file, and then did something I was not expecting. She smiled and said, "It's always nice to see you. Actually, while you're here, we do still need updated information on the business expansion Blake mentioned. Since your name is attached to the credit authorization, we'll need your signature to move forward." I kept my face completely still. "Of course," I said. "I'll look at what you need." She turned her monitor slightly so I could read the screen, and I looked at it the way I had learned to look at things I needed to fully absorb before responding, with a calm that lived only on the outside. Blake was planning to expand. He'd apparently been in conversations with this bank about a new line of credit and a larger operating account. He'd been talking about growth and opportunity and forward momentum. And his plan, his big, confident, post-Norma plan, still had my name attached to the credit that made all of it possible. He had announced over pot roast that I was holding him back. He had changed his passwords by midnight. He had already called the supplier and given me the formal exit. But he had not, apparently, thought to look at whose name was holding the floor beneath his feet. I thanked the officer, told her I would need to review the documents first, and walked out of the building into the cool morning air. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands in my lap. Then I drove to the attorney my husband had trusted with everything. The attorney's office smelled like old books and careful work. His name was Mr. Odell, and he had represented my husband for 20 years before I ever walked through his door the first time. He recognized me immediately. He brought out coffee without being asked, and then went to his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder that was thicker than I remembered. "I wondered when you'd be back," he said. He sat down and opened the folder and reminded me, in clear and patient language, of something I had signed more than 4 years earlier. Something I had barely processed at the time, because grief does things to your ability to fully absorb documents, even important ones. The money I had brought to that household, the money from my husband's life insurance and the sale of our family home, had not been given as a gift. It had never been intended as a gift. My husband, who had known Blake for 6 years before he died and had formed certain opinions about him, had insisted on something before I moved a single box into that house. He insisted it be protected on paper. There was a formal loan agreement, there were terms, there was a repayment structure, and a clause that tied the money to the property itself, meaning the house could not be sold, refinanced, or used as leverage for any new financing without addressing the outstanding loan first. Blake had signed it. Amber had signed it. They had both signed it, and then I suspected, quietly forgotten about it, or decided it was something they could deal with later, some distant future problem that would never actually arrive. Mr. Odell set the document on the desk between us and folded his hands. "The house he just threw you out of," he said quietly, "cannot be touched without your cooperation." I drank my coffee and let that settle. I left that house with more care than they deserved from me. I spent 2 full days before I moved out, making sure the children would be all right. I labeled every medicine bottle in the cabinet with dosage, timing, and the name of the doctor who had prescribed it. I printed the school schedule and pinned it to the refrigerator with the drop-off and pickup times highlighted. I updated the lunch routine and the allergy list and left a calendar on the kitchen counter with every appointment, sports practice, and school event for the next 3 months, written in clear, careful letters. The children had not hurt me. They were not responsible for what their father had decided. Whatever anger I carried out of that house with me, none of it belonged anywhere near them. Amber helped me carry boxes to the car, and she held the children longer than she held me on the way out. That stung in the particular way that only your own daughter can sting you. Not like a wound that draws blood, but like a bruise that sits deep and takes a long time to surface. Blake stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and the look on his face that I had always privately called his relief look. The look people wear when they believe the hard part is finally done and everything is going to get easier from here. I took my laptop. I took every original document and record I had ever created, printed, or filed for his business. I took the software license I had paid for myself. I took my notebooks and I took my silence. I drove to the small rental I had arranged and I carried my boxes inside and I sat down at the kitchen table in my new, quiet, very small space. And I thought, very carefully, about what came next. The first call came 48 hours after I left. It was from the school nurse. One of the grandchildren had a headache and was asking to come home, and when the nurse called the contact numbers on file, she reached Blake, who did not know where the children's Tylenol was kept or what dose was appropriate for the child's age, and wait. She then called me out of habit, because I had been the contact who answered questions for 4 years. I gave her the information she needed. Then I stayed off the phone for the rest of the morning. By the afternoon, the pediatrician's office called about a follow-up appointment that nobody had confirmed. Then my granddaughter's teacher sent a note home about an unsigned field trip permission form that had been sitting in the backpack for a week, which I would have noticed on Monday when I went through their bags after school, the way I always did. Blake called at 10 that night. I watched my phone screen light up with his name, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more solid, like the feeling of a door finally fitting properly in its frame after years of sticking. He was calling about the inhaler refill form, the one I had reminded Amber about twice in the last month and written a note about on the calendar with a box around it. He needed to know which pharmacy and which doctor and which insurance code went on the form. I looked at my phone until the screen went dark. Then I set it face down on the table and made myself a cup of tea. For the first time in 4 years, I let something that was Blake's problem remain entirely Blake's problem. It felt strange. It also felt like the first clean breath I had taken in a very long time. The business started bleeding in the second week. A flooring supplier named Vic, a straightforward, no-nonsense man I had spoken to on the phone at least twice a month for 3 years, called my cell number out of pure habit. He asked when Blake was planning to catch up on the balance. He said it had been sitting on the books longer than usual, and he wanted to make sure everything was all right before he made any decisions about future orders. I told him, as simply as I could, that I no longer worked for Blake. A pause. A long one. "You don't," he said. "I don't," I said. He told me he would need to speak directly with Blake then. He thanked me for always being organized and easy to work with and said he hoped things were well for me personally. Then he said he was going to have to put a hold on delivery until the account was brought current. That call was not my doing. I had not called Vic. I had not told him anything he didn't already know from looking at his own accounts receivable. I had simply told him the truth about my situation. Blake called me that same evening and accused me of deliberately sabotaging his business. I listened to him without interrupting. When he finished, I told him clearly and without any particular emotion that I had not sabotaged anything. I told him that Vic had called me, not the other way around, and that I had simply been honest. Then I said something I had been holding for a long time. "You kept his account current because I kept your account current, Blake. That's not sabotage. That's just what happens when the person who was quietly holding things together stops being available." He hung up without responding. I wrote the date and the content of the conversation in my notebook. Amber came to my rental on a Wednesday afternoon with her jaw set and her eyes hard. She said I had taken their books. She said Blake was trying to access the accounts and couldn't find the records he needed, and that I had no right to take files that belonged to the business. I let her finish. Then I walked her through what I had actually taken. My laptop, which I had purchased myself. The accounting software, which was licensed under my name and paid for from my own account. My handwritten notebooks, which contained my own notes made in my own time. My copies of supplier contracts that I had personally negotiated, and every document I had ever created, printed, or organized that existed because of my labor, not because of any salary, because there had never been a salary. Amber said nothing. Then I opened the folder I had started the night I moved out. I set it on the kitchen table between us and let her look. Page 1 was a list, a careful, dated, specific list I had made for myself, because I am the kind of person who documents things out of habit and love for accuracy. Groceries I had bought from my own account when theirs ran short. Utility bills I had paid to keep the lights on during slow months. Soccer registration fees. Dental copays. The month I had quietly covered part of their mortgage because Blake was waiting on a large payment that was running late. I had never told Amber about most of it. I hadn't wanted to make her feel ashamed or scared. She stood in my kitchen looking at that list for a long time. Then she sat down. Her face had changed in the way faces change when a person starts to understand something they had been choosing not to look at directly. Not shocked, exactly, but unsettled. Like the ground she had been standing on had just revealed itself to be something different than she thought. Blake did not deny any of it. He showed up at my rental 3 days after Amber's visit. I let him in because I wanted to see what version of events he had prepared, and because some conversations need to be had face to face if you want to know what someone actually believes. He looked at the folder on my table, and he said, very plainly, that I had chosen to insert myself into their lives, that I had chosen to pay those bills, to cover those costs, to do that work, and that choosing to do something is not the same as being owed something for it. He said, now that my feelings were hurt, I was trying to use what I had done as leverage against them. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. He mentioned, with a kind of practiced confidence, that he was about to land a major renovation contract with a large local church. He described it like a turning point, like the proof that everything was about to be different. Like one good job was going to rewrite 4 years of books I had kept, and bills I had paid, and slow months I had absorbed so quietly that nobody ever had to feel the weight of them. Before he left, Amber called him from the other room, and he stepped out. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked at me with something shaking very quietly behind her eyes. How bad is it really? She asked. Her voice was different than it had been when she arrived angry. Smaller. Genuinely uncertain. I looked at her for a moment. You haven't seen the worst part yet, I told her. I said it gently because she was still my daughter, but I said it clearly because it was true. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she followed her husband back out to the car. While their house was wobbling, I stepped back into myself. A woman I used to work with before I moved in with Amber and Blake, a practical, warm, no-nonsense property manager named Cora, reached out 2 weeks after I left. She had heard I was available. She asked if I could come in part-time and help clean up the billing and payroll at her property company, which had gotten disorganized over a busy season. I said yes. I said it the same day she asked. Walking into an actual office, sitting at a clean desk with a computer that had my name as the login, being handed a pile of work that was genuinely mine to do. It was so different from what I had been doing for years that the contrast took my breath away slightly. On my 3rd day, Cora stopped by my desk and said, very simply, "We're lucky to have you." 4 words. Nothing complicated. Nothing earned through 4 years of invisible effort, or late nights or quiet sacrifices. Just a normal, honest acknowledgement of ordinary competent work. I had to look at my screen for a moment before I trusted myself to respond. Then the phone on my desk rang. A woman from Blake's business insurance company said she was calling because my name was still listed on several of the business documents, including the liability policy and one of the outstanding claim files. I thanked her and told her I would be addressing that. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment. I had walked out of that house thinking I was done. Thinking I had taken my name with me when I left, but I hadn't. My name was still there. Still attached. Still backing promises I had not been consulted about, and liabilities I had not agreed to carry. That had to change. And I needed to be the one to change it. I did not call Blake, I did not send an angry message or threaten anything, or try to explain myself to anyone who hadn't asked. That was not how I wanted to handle it, and more importantly, it was not the most effective way to handle it. I wrote one letter. I typed it on plain paper, kept it professional and factual, and had Mr. Odell review it before I sent it. The letter stated, clearly and without dramatic language, that I was no longer a representative of Blake's company in any capacity. It stated that I was formally withdrawing my name from any existing business associations, including the insurance documents, the supplier accounts where I had been listed as a contact, and any ongoing loan applications or credit authorizations where my name or backing appeared. The letter also stated a specific effective date. That date was 2 days before the church renovation contract was scheduled to begin. I did not choose that date to cause harm. I chose it because it was the earliest legally clean date available, given the processing times involved. The timing was what it was. But I will tell you honestly, when Mr. Odell looked at the calendar and said, "You understand this lands just before that church project," I did not ask him to move it. Some things you do not go out of your way to cushion. I had been the floor beneath Blake's feet for 4 years. He had looked down at that floor and called it dead weight and given it 30 days to get out. I was not going to hurry myself on his behalf. The letter went out on a Friday. Certified mail with a signature requirement on delivery. I went back to work at Cora's office and answered the phone and cleaned up the billing and was, for the second week in a row, exactly where I was supposed to be. He came to my office. Not to the rental. Not on a quiet evening when I could hear him out privately and handle it with some degree of dignity for everyone involved. He drove to the property management office on Marsh Street where I worked, parked crooked at the curb, and came through the front door loud. I was at my desk when Cora's assistant looked back at me with wide eyes and said someone was asking for me at the front. I walked out. Blake was standing in the lobby with the kind of energy that had nowhere to go. Red-faced, jaw tight, words already lined up and waiting. He started talking before I had fully crossed the room. Something about betrayal, about pulling the rug out, about destroying something he had spent years building. He kept going. I let him, because there is useful information in the way angry people choose to express themselves, and I had learned over 62 years to pay attention when someone revealed themselves fully. Cora appeared in the doorway of her office. 2 other staff members were at their desks. The front door was glass. He had chosen this location and this moment himself, and now he was filling it with everything he had been holding since the letter arrived. I waited until he ran out of momentum. Then I said, quietly, in the voice I use when I want someone to actually hear something, "You told me I was holding you back, Blake. I am finally stepping aside." He looked at me. "That's it," I said. "That's all this is." The words hit him the wrong way because they were calm and he was not, and because calm is the most disorienting thing you can offer someone who came prepared to fight. He stood there for a moment, recalculating. Then he turned and walked back out through the glass door. I watched him go. Then I turned around, thanked my colleagues for their patience, and went back to my desk. Blake took his version of events to a family Sunday dinner at his aunt's house the following weekend. I heard about it from his cousin, who had always liked me, and who sent me a text afterward, saying I should probably know what was being said. According to the text, Blake told the family that I had gotten bitter. He said I couldn't handle being asked to respect reasonable boundaries, so I had started interfering with his business out of spite. He said I had always been controlling and that what looked like generosity was actually a way for me to make myself indispensable so no one could ever ask me to leave. He was very convincing, apparently. For one long minute, reading that text at my kitchen table, I felt the old familiar pull. The urge to call someone and explain myself, to correct the record in real time, to make sure the people in that room understood what the truth actually was before Blake's version had time to harden. I set my phone down. And then my cousin by marriage, a sweet, blunt woman named Faye, texted me separately and told me that Blake's story had been going beautifully until my granddaughter, who is 6 years old and completely unbothered by social consequence, had looked up from her plate and asked in a clear and carrying voice why her daddy had called Grandma dead weight the night he threw her out. Faye said the table had gone very quiet. Amber, sitting right there, had said nothing. I read that part twice. Then I put my phone face down on the table and looked at the wall for a while, because Amber saying nothing hurt in a different way than anything Blake had ever done. Blake, I understood. Amber, I had raised. And her silence in that room, in front of the family, while her own daughter told the truth that she couldn't bring herself to tell, that one stayed with me a long time. That night, I spread everything across my bed. 4 years of calendars. The paper ones I kept on the refrigerator, photographed and saved to a folder on my phone. Receipts organized by month, going back to my first week in that house. School forms, doctor's notes, the birthday party invitation I had RSVP'd to when Amber forgot. The signed permission slip for the class trip to the science museum that I had found crumpled at the bottom of a backpack and smoothed out and mailed in the same afternoon. Payroll records I had processed for Blake's 3 employees, month after month, from a system I had set up and maintained myself. Supplier invoices with my notes in the margins. Utility transfers from my personal account. Grocery receipts from the months when Blake's slow season ran into school supply season, and both happened at the same time, and I had just absorbed it quietly without saying anything. All of it spread across my bed in the small rental room with one lamp on and the sound of the street outside. I sat in the middle of it. And something shifted. Not a dramatic shift. Not the kind of moment you would recognize from the outside. More like a slow internal realignment. The kind where you stop wanting one thing and start understanding that you had been wanting the wrong thing all along. I had spent 4 years wanting Blake and Amber to see what I was doing, wanting them to notice and name it and be grateful for it, wanting to feel valued in the house where I had invested my savings and my daily labor and most of my quiet energy. That night, looking at 4 years spread across a single bed, I stopped wanting their approval. I started wanting something better. Something that was entirely mine, built on ground that no one else could take from under me. The mortgage payment came due on the 15th. I was not watching for it. I had not been waiting for it. I did not have to do anything to make it happen. It happened entirely on its own, the way consequences tend to happen when they are simply the result of choices already made. Blake had been expecting a large payment from a client, and the client had delayed. That part was not unusual. Slow payments were a regular feature of the remodeling business, and for 4 years, whenever a slow payment collided with a fixed expense, I had been the quiet bridge between the two. A short-term cover from my account, a call to the bank to request a brief extension, a note in the records so the pattern could be spotted and managed. But I was not there anymore. And the bridge had not been replaced with anything. Blake missed the mortgage payment. He did not miss it because there was no money. According to what Amber told me later, there was money. It was simply in the wrong account, earmarked for a shiny new work truck he had purchased the week before, which he described to everyone he knew as a necessary investment in the business. Mr. Odell sent formal notice the following week. Not a threat, not an ultimatum. A clean, professional letter reminding Blake and Amber of the terms of the original loan agreement, noting the missed payment, and stating that under the terms they had both signed, a formal review of the loan status was now required. That was the day Blake's name stopped being the only name in the story. Because the moment Mr. Odell's letter arrived, both of them had to stop pretending the money I had brought into that house was background noise. It had always had a name. It had always had terms. They had simply chosen to forget that, until forgetting became too expensive. The refinance attempt came 3 weeks later. Blake had been trying to find a way around the formal review by approaching a different lender and restructuring the existing debt. If he could get a new loan large enough to cover the old one, the logic went, he could start fresh. Cleaner numbers, cleaner books, my name no longer anywhere in the picture. He ran into a wall. The lender pulled the full property record. They asked for current financials. They asked for documentation of the business income, which had been kept in my accounting system, which I had taken with me when I left, and which Blake had not maintained in any organized form since my departure. They asked for clean records of outstanding debts and obligations. He had none of those things. Not in usable form. Amber went looking for answers in the file drawer in the hallway closet, the one she had walked past every single day for 4 years without ever really opening. She found the closing documents from when the house was purchased. She found the original loan agreement with her own signature on it and Blake's signature on it, and a clause, clear as anything, about the terms under which the loaned amount had to be addressed before any refinancing or sale could proceed. And clipped to the front of that folder, in my husband's handwriting on a small piece of notepaper, was something he had written years before he died. Protect Norma first. Amber called me that evening. Her voice sounded like someone who had just read a document in a language they thought they knew and discovered they had been misunderstanding it for years. She didn't say much, but something in her voice had changed. The part that had been loyally, defensively certain that Blake's version of events was essentially correct. That part sounded cracked. Once Amber started looking, she found more than I had found. This is the part I want to be careful about, because some of it was genuinely painful to learn, and some of it was not mine to have known. But Amber chose to tell me, and I believe she did so because she needed someone to help her understand what she was looking at. Blake had been taking cash out of the business. Not a large amount at once, small amounts, regularly, routed through a category he had labeled Materials Advance in the records. A category that meant nothing in terms of actual inventory, and that I had noticed before, but had assumed was a system he used for petty cash. He had buried 3 years of past due tax letters in his tool chest in the garage. He had told Amber, every slow month, that the business was behind because clients were slow to pay, and the market was difficult, and I was not doing enough to manage the accounts. When Amber confronted him, he did not apologize. He said that I had made him feel small. He said that having his mother-in-law manage his business books made him feel like he couldn't run his own company, like he was being watched and evaluated and found lacking all the time. He said he deserved to have something that was just his. Amber said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You told me we weren't getting ahead because of the market." He said he had been under a lot of pressure. She said very quietly, "You said it was Norma's fault." That was the moment, she told me later, when she stopped seeing an overwhelmed man who had made mistakes. She saw instead a man who had made deliberate choices and had been handing her other people's names to explain the results. She came to me after dark on a Thursday. She knocked on my door, and I opened it, and she stood on my small porch with her coat buttoned wrong and her eyes red at the edges. I stepped back and let her in without making her ask. I made tea. I did not rush. When she sat down, I could see she had been crying for a while before she arrived, and that she was trying to present herself as more composed than she was. I recognized that. I had done it myself in this same kitchen, in this same chair, more than once. I opened the binders. I had put them together over the weeks since I left. Organized, dated, clear. Not as ammunition. I had put them together the way I put everything together, out of discipline and the need to understand my own life clearly. I showed her the utility bills I had paid, the account extensions I had called in, the summer camp deposit I had covered the year Blake's spring season ran dry, the grocery totals by month, the medical co-pays, the dates of every mortgage-adjacent moment I had quietly absorbed without telling her so she wouldn't have to feel scared about the state of her own house. She turned the pages without speaking. Then she looked up and said, in a voice that was small and genuinely confused, "I thought you were just living with us." I looked at her. I said, "No, sweetheart. I was holding you together." It was not said with anger. It was said the way you tell someone a true thing that you have been waiting a long time to say, gently but completely, because they are finally ready to hear it, and because the moment deserves honesty more than it deserves comfort. She put her face in her hands and cried for a while. I let her. I sat beside her, and I let her. Just when it seemed like Blake had run out of road, life handed him one last opening. I heard about it through Cora, whose husband served on the building committee at the church Blake had been trying to land. The renovation project had stalled due to Blake's paperwork problems and the missing business records, but the church board was giving contractors one final window to submit corrected documentation. The deadline was that Friday. Blake apparently believed this was his second chance. People around town reported seeing him with the energy of someone who had been near the bottom and had just spotted a ladder. He was making calls, he was talking to suppliers. He was, by all accounts, acting as if the last several weeks had been a rough patch that was now definitively behind him. On Thursday afternoon, the church administrator called my cell phone. His name was Pastor Wendell, and he was a careful, soft-spoken man who had called me directly many times over the years, because I was the one who returned calls promptly and submitted paperwork correctly, and remembered what had been discussed in previous conversations. He said he was following up on the project file and had a question about one of the submitted documents. I told him, as clearly and kindly as I could, that I was no longer with Blake's company. He asked who was now handling the business administration. I told him I didn't know, but that it was no longer me. A brief pause. I see, he said. I did not add anything to that. I did not explain. I did not offer context or background or suggestion. I simply told the truth about my situation, the same way I had told Vic the truth about my situation, and I let Pastor Wendell do with it whatever a careful, responsible person would do with that information. The church gave the project to another company. I found out through Cora, who heard it from her husband that same Friday. The board had made the decision quietly. No drama, no public explanation, simply a shift in the file from Blake's company name to another contractor who had submitted clean documentation on time. Blake came to my door that night. Not the furious version who had stormed my office parking lot. Not the loud, red-faced man from the lobby. This was a different Blake. Quieter, smaller, the kind of smaller that happens when pride finally gets outweighed by the reality of an empty account and a lost contract. He sat on my porch step without being invited. I stood in the doorway and listened. He talked about what the job would have meant to him, to the business, to the family, to his sense of himself. He talked about how close he had been. He went through it as if telling the story in order might somehow make it end differently. And then, in the middle of it, while he was trying to explain what had gone wrong and whose fault it was, he said something that he clearly had not planned to say. He said, he knew people trusted me more than they trusted him. He said that had always bothered him. He said that when Vic called me, instead of him, when the bank called me instead of him, when Pastor Wendell knew my voice and not his, it made him feel invisible inside his own business. He said it bitterly, like it was something I had done to him. I looked at him on my porch step in the dark. You built nothing by tearing me down, I said. You only lost what I was building for you. He didn't answer that. He sat there for another minute and then stood up and put his hands in his pockets. And then he walked to his truck and drove away. He came back 2 nights later. This time he came with an argument. The kind of argument built from pieces collected and assembled over 2 days. Rehearsed, structured, designed to hit harder than the raw and vulnerable conversation on the porch step had managed to hit. He had gone away and thought about what to say, and now he was back to say it properly. He told me family helps family. He said I had benefited from living in their home, and that helping in return was only reasonable and fair. He said if I had simply stayed in the background and continued doing what I had been doing, none of this would have happened. He said I had taken a reasonable arrangement and turned it into a standoff because I wanted power, not because I had been wronged. Then he said the part that told me everything. He said I should have been grateful that Amber had let me move in. I sat across from him at my small kitchen table, and I listened to every sentence, and I watched his face while he spoke. I was looking for something specific, and I found it. Blake did not resent my age. He did not resent my advice, or my presence, or my attachment to the children. He resented that the house ran better when I was in it. He resented that his suppliers trusted my word more than his. He resented that the bank officer smiled when she saw me walk in. He resented that his own employees knew to call me when there was a problem, and that the problem would be resolved. He resented that I was more reliable than he was in his own life. I closed the door, not with a slam, with the quiet, solid click of a door that fits perfectly in its frame. For the first time since the dinner with the pot roast and the printed sheet of paper, I felt nothing but clear. The bank meeting was in November. Mr. Odell was there. Blake and Amber were there with their own attorney. The room had the temperature of something formal and irreversible. On the table, in the clean folder the bank officer had prepared and placed in front of us before we even sat down, was the full documented picture of 4 years of quiet, invisible, unacknowledged work. My down payment in the closing records, the loan agreement with the signed terms, the missed mortgage payment, the failed refinance attempt with the incomplete records. The outstanding tax obligations that had surfaced once the tool chest was emptied. The business account statements showing the cash withdrawals over 36 months. Blake sat across from me and said several things. He said I had set him up. He said I had quietly been positioning myself so that he could never succeed on his own terms. He said everything I had done was calculated to make him dependent. He said each version louder than the previous one, as if repetition and volume could together make a false story become true. His attorney shifted in his seat. Amber looked at the table. I let him finish completely. I gave him the full space to say every version of it. Then I said one sentence. I didn't ruin you, Blake. I stopped rescuing you. His attorney looked at his notes. Mr. Odell looked at the folder. The bank officer looked at neither of them. The room was very quiet for a long moment. Blake opened his mouth and then closed it again. He had no answer for that sentence. There isn't one. There is no effective response to a true statement made calmly in a room full of documented evidence. Volume had stopped working. Repetition had stopped working. There was nothing left to try. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. And for the first time since the dinner with the pot roast and the printed sheet of paper, I felt the full weight of 4 years lift. Amber broke in that room. I watched it happen, and I did not try to stop it, because some things need to happen completely before anything new can begin. She started with a composed and prepared kind of speech, something about good intentions and difficult circumstances and poor communication, and how everyone in the room had made mistakes they regretted, and perhaps there was a way forward that felt fair to all sides. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, the composed part stopped. She admitted, through tears that came slowly and then didn't stop, that she had let it happen. That she had known, in the way you know things you don't look directly, that I was covering more than my share. That she had told herself the story that made it easier. That I was doing it because I wanted to. That I was fulfilled by it. That I was the kind of woman who didn't mind being invisible if the people she loved were comfortable. She said she had let Blake use me because it made her daily life easier, and because she had been afraid of what she would have to face if she made him stop. She said as long as I kept managing the crisis, she didn't have to acknowledge how fragile everything actually was. It was the most honest thing I had heard her say in years. It cost her something real to say it. She left Blake. She told me that privately, after the bank meeting, in the parking lot with her keys in her hand. She said she had been thinking about it for weeks, and this room had made it clear. She signed the papers for the house to be sold. When Blake, at the end of that day, called me one final time and asked if there was any way I could help save it, I told him the answer as simply as I could. I could not. And I would not. The house sold in January. Under the terms of the loan agreement, my money came back first, principal and interest both, exactly as my husband had insisted when he wrote the terms and sat Blake down and watched him sign his name. It was enough. I bought a small white cottage at the edge of town. A proper kitchen, a garden, a front porch with 2 chairs. I signed the papers on a cold, clear morning. The bookkeeping practice started as a favor for a plumber Cora knew. Within 2 months, I had 6 small clients, sole proprietors who kept receipts in shoeboxes, and every one of them said thank you when I fixed something. 2 ordinary words. I had not realized how much I missed them until they became regular again. Amber moved into a modest rental across town. She got a part-time bookkeeping job, which I helped her prepare for. She is learning, slowly and honestly, what it means to be the person responsible for her own life, rather than the person waiting for someone else to hold it together. We have dinner some Sundays. It is not perfect, but it is real. Blake called in the spring. He said he was trying to get organized again and wondered if I could help him get started. I told him the truth. The full, plain, unhurried truth he had been owed since the night he slid that printed paper across my dinner table. The only thing I had ever been holding back, I told him, was the collapse he had spent years earning. Then I wished him well. And I meant it. If you've ever been treated like a burden by people who were standing on your shoulders, drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Subscribe, because sometimes the quietest person at the table is the one holding the whole house up.